Jack C. Tanner. I was born in Denver, Colorado, December the 26th, 1925. I remember in junior high school, and this now you go back to 1938, in that period, 37, 38, I had a teacher by the name of Miss Holly in Denver, and she was a aunt of Ernie Pyle. And Ernie Pyle at that time was in England, and he was writing about the bombardments, the German bombing of London and the things. And it was amazing, you know, to read the letters that she got from Ernie, hear her read these letters and explain to us what was going on in those blitzes over there and that kind of thing. On December 7th, 1941, I was caddying at the time. Not that particular day, but this was a day that December 7th on Sunday, a bunch of caddies had decided to go to Wellshire Golf Course in Denver and play golf. So we were playing golf when the Japanese were in the process of bombing Pearl Harbor, or at least that morning. And we were on about the 7th hole of Wellshire when some fellow came running down the fairway and said the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And we really didn't know where Pearl Harbor was. But we adjourned the golf game, went to the parking lot, and one of the boys had his father's car, and we drove downtown to the old customs house. And there was probably about 2 blocks of 4 deep line of men waiting to enlist. And one branch of the line would go to the Army, and one branch would go to the Navy, and one branch would go to the Marines or whatever. In the fall of 1942, while I was still in high school, I went to a government aircraft repair school in Denver. And so my last class period was at 2 o'clock, and it was a study period after that. So at that point I left the school, got on a streetcar and went downtown and went 3 to 11 to a government aircraft school. And when I finished there in January of 1943, they sent me to Hillfield, Utah. And I was working on aircraft armament at the time. And I enlisted in the United States Navy Combat Engineers, Seabees. And my age at that point was 17. And I was sent to Camp Perry, Williamsburg, Virginia, for basic training. After completion, I was assigned to the 126th Seabee Battalion and sent to Camp Endicott, Rhode Island, Cranston, Rhode Island, for advanced weapons and construction training. And then to Camp Parks, California. We went clear across the country to Camp Parks, California for advanced weapons and more construction training. And then on to Port Hueneme, California, which of course is that was a port of embarkation for amphibious training. Well, in Camp Parks, California, they had a training facility down there for Navy divers. Trained in that period, they were using the deep water suits. Once they went beyond about 70, 80 feet, they went to the deep water suit. And so I went through that schooling down there while I was there, and I was a kind of a backup to the and we had one official diver, and so if they needed some reason, they needed a diver, and in the Marshals, they did dive a few times on Japanese ships for intelligence purposes. They wanted different things, and we embarked from Port Hueneme in February 1944, and with a brief stop in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor to form a convoy. And we proceeded then to the invasion of the Marshall Islands in the Central Pacific. And on completion of building an air base there and boat docks and living quarters and so on, I was transferred to the 110th Battalion for the invasion of Saipan and Tinian. Eniwetok, we went in second wave. The The other end of the atoll was Seabee Island, or Anjabee. I don't really know the correct pronunciation probably. But we went in there fourth wave, followed the Marine Corps. And so it was our job really to aid the Marines, get in and get whatever they needed to continue whatever was the fight was. On islands like the Marshall Islands, which were very limited in size, it was a very short period of time. I mean, you hit the beach, you were there overnight or a matter of a couple of days, and you secured the island, and that was it. And then became the work of building the air bases and whatever. The Seabee battalion that went into Bougainville landed ahead of the Marine Corps, and this was an accident, but it did happen. And they were actually building a fighter strip when the Marines rolled in. So, and this is a story that has been printed. In fact, I think I've got a copy of it. So there were times when they were in the thick of it ahead of time, but generally in the Pacific, in the islands, the first move was a raider battalion. Generally would go in, the Marines, and they would go in rubber rafts from submarines or whatever, and destroy as much of the enemy communications and stuff as they could, and then that would be followed by the assault. So that was generally maybe a 24-hour period or something like that from the time they went in, and then the Marines, regular Marine division, would go in. And the raider battalions would generally pull out. A lot of times they would go in and be out before the firing even really started. You know, they tried not to use weapons unless they were forced to. They just went in and did their damage and got out. The Marines generally, the first wave would go in to secure the beach, and then the next thing, of course, they had to have ammunition and stuff to move up, and then we would generally bring in that kind of stuff, a lot of that, on landing barges, and bulldozers, and in the Marshalls, for example, in Anahuac, they had concrete pillboxes, the Japanese, and we used bulldozers to knock out those pillboxes. Now it's a John Wayne thing, but it was true. We did use them to knock down palm trees, and we didn't have any armor on them at all. They were standard Caterpillars. The only thing we did have, for the most part, we carried a carbine or sidearms and anything, but nothing else. Japanese would put snipers in the trees, tie themselves in the top of a tree, a palm tree, and they were there, you know, until the tree was either knocked down or they shot out of the tree, and that didn't generally happen because they were belted in. They would fasten themselves up there. So, landing at Seabee, I came in the second wave, although the battalion came in the fourth wave. I was in a barge that came in a second wave. We were pinned on the beach for a whole night, pretty much, just right on the beach. One of the most devastating memories I have was, I think, is the morning when it became light, and I was on the beach in a hole of water, and could look back behind me in the beach and see bodies floating in the surf, and then it struck home to me what war was all about. There were a lot of good young men that never got to the beach, and there were situations much worse than this one. For instance, like Tarawa, where they landed before they got to the beach. They hit coral reef before they got to the beach, and a lot of them drowned before they got to the beach. This happened because of the charts that they had were wrong. There was a shelf there that they didn't expect to hit. You know, they were going right into the beach with the barges, and there was a coral shelf in there that they didn't know about. And a lot of the intelligence information that they had came from natives. Some of it came from studies that had been made, previously by scientists and different islands and stuff like that. So it wasn't always accurate. It was a different style of war in the Pacific than Europe, and the infantrymen did not fit in. The Army infantry did not fit into the Pacific picture as well as the Marine Corps type of amphibious quick strike operation, that type of thing. The Marine Corps amphibious island jumping type of warfare that occurred in the Pacific was not the infantry's type of style of fighting. And where, for instance, in landings, they were taught pretty much in the Army to run in, hit the prone position, and when you reach a beach, and set up your fire line. In the Marine Corps, they knew that on those islands, that those guns, machine guns, were set to rake the beach, and so if you got down into the prone position, you would probably get your head blown off. So they pretty much ran onto beaches in the crouch, and when they were hit in the legs generally. Most of the guys, more so than headshots, I mean. And there was a saying that by the grace of God and a few Marines, MacArthur returned to the Philippines. That's true. They were unusual in the fact that first you had a nucleus of men that were really too old to be in war. Because you had a lot of guys who were men that were building contractors and one thing or another that had had substantial careers before, and they were the battalion commanders and the executive officers and that kind of stuff. And a lot of them were probably, like I say, too old to be in the situation they were in, not from the standpoint of knowledge and experience, but from the standpoint of physical. In fact, we had a warrant officer who was a electrician who worked for a public utility, and a warrant officer, and he was a World War I veteran. On the other hand, you had the other end of the spectrum. You had the real young, like myself, that had no real background to the thing, and we were the other end of the spectrum. I was a heavy equipment operator. I operated principally D8 Caterpillars, and I also worked on cranes, shovels. I did that. I did some amphibious. I ran some LCMs. We built hospitals. We built docks. We built every kind of facility that the military would need, And when we left an island, we left a pretty good base, In other words, the troops that came in there would take over would have a pretty good have a commissary and a bakery, and then gosh knows what else. We built all kinds of stuff. Chief petty officer in our outfit that was a baker by trade, and he was more than just a baker. He had run a sizable bread company in the East, and he put a bakery in there that supplied the whole Central Pacific. I don't think we had some instances where we had very high casualties, but generally speaking, we were it was moderate. I think there was like Iwo Jima, for example, we lost like 90% of the battalion that went in there were casualties. On the other end of the spectrum, Sicily, we lost a lot of men there, and we lost most of the men. Close to 100% were casualties, either wounded or killed in that. And what they were doing there was putting in pontoon docks so that they could bring troops in, and putting those pontoon docks in, they were pretty much targets sitting on those floating pontoons, and they pretty much devastated that battalion. Once the island was secured, then we were subject to bombings, fairly frequently, and depending on the time frame, how long those things lasted. In the Marshalls, the Japanese would fly in quite high and drop their bombs. They didn't get down very close. They were, and they gave us a lot of trouble until the P-38s came in, Lightnings, and they had the range to chase them or to intercept them, and so that kind of put the end of that until we got into the Marianas, and then we had frequent raids in the Marianas. The last major raid I can remember in the Marianas was Christmas, 1944 was the last big Japanese raid there. Yeah. They came in, we had a Christmas party, battalion party, and kind of like a carnival. And when that was over, they started coming, and they lasted all night, just wave after wave of Japanese bombers. And on Tinian, I went through an experience where I was going down at night down a runway. We'd been doing some bomb repair on a runway, and I was going down the runway, and a Betty bomber came in. It was dusk, and he came in low to avoid our radar, and they had his guns firing, and he dropped 400 anti-personnel bombs within about 200-300 yards of where we were at around us, and none of them went off. I'm here today because of that. I can tell you that. While constructing airstrips for B-29s on Tinian, I also served on a 40mm anti-aircraft gun crew through over 100 air raids. The Japanese planes were Zeros, for example, had no armor on them, and this cost them a lot of men. You know, they were very maneuverable because they didn't have any armor. But if they got any shots into the fuel tanks or into the seats, you know, they were gone, and they would just burst into flame, just a ball of flame when they were hit. The leaflets I have were taken right, you know, from the leaflets that were loaded on B-29s, and were dropped over Tokyo, over Hiroshima, over Nagasaki, all of those places, and they dropped tons and tons and tons. And if you know the capacity of a B-29, the bomb capacity, you can imagine the number of leaflets they must have dropped when they went out loaded and and dropped these things over those cities. And the fact that the Japanese, in spite of that, the Japanese public did not resist the Emperor Hirohito more is amazing to me. I mean, because it wasn't a situation where they didn't know. It wasn't a situation where, you know, like in Germany, for example, Hitler had a pretty tight control over the populace. They had to know when they dropped these things off. Everybody read them. Anybody who could read read them, you know, and why they pursued the thing to the point they did, and finally become victims of the atomic bomb. I'll never understand. I just don't. I would have thought even the leaflets that they dropped, telling them how their own soldiers were dying in these islands that were passed by, and so on and so forth, would have had more effect on them. We worked very closely with the 29 crews and giving them the type of facility that they needed. Iwo Jima became a necessity because of the, you know, of the chance of losing aircraft that couldn't get back to the Marianas, and so that was the reason for taking Iwo Jima. And there wasn't much there other than that, other than a place to bring down plane. Do it. And Iwo Jima was of course very costly to the Marine Corps, and one of those islands that was costly to the Seabees. The Seabee Battalion was pretty well hit there too. We became aware in 1945 because of the type of B-29 that was being brought in there, that there was something vastly different. They had a totally different bomb bay than any of the 29s that had been there previously. And this was to accommodate the big boy bomb, which is what we learned later. But we built some assembly sheds on Northfield Tinian. We had 4 B-29 strips on Northfield Tinian. Tinian was the biggest air base out there at the time, although most of what you heard was coming from Fleet Headquarters, Guam. Tinian was really the major air base out there. It had we had 4 29 strips, 2 Navy bomber strips, and a fighter strip on that one island. And incidentally, all of the Seabee battalions on Tinian and Saipan had B-29s with their battalion insignias on them. We knew from those bombers coming in something was different, and they had us build these assembly sheds and they were pretty careful about what was said or done about those things. But what they did was assemble the bomb. They brought them in there, and that brought on, of course, you've heard the story of the Indianapolis, I imagine. And the Indianapolis was the one that brought in the nuclear warheads. And it was on their way out that they got attacked by the Japanese and sunk, and most of the men became shark bait, unfortunately. There's no doubt in my mind that it saved maybe 250,000 lives. I'm talking about Allied lives. I'm not talking, and God knows how many Japanese. I mean, had we gone, made an invasion there and gone through all of those cities and fought our way through the whole chain of islands, the Japanese, it would have been horrendous, and the Japanese would have been a lot worse off than they were with the casualties they took at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a way, even though it cost all the lives that it cost, the bombing, the atomic bomb, it saved many, many more Japanese lives. Also made it possible for them to rebuild and to create a world economy, and so in a lot of ways we did them a favor, in the method that we took the end of war. The Bronze Star came from my duty in anti-aircraft on Tinian. The big patch in the center, of course, is the Navy Seabees patch. The medal on the right side is the Asiatic Pacific Medal, and there are 2 stars, meaning that was 2 campaigns, the Marshalls and the Marianas. This one over here is the American Theater, and anybody who served outside of the United States in American Theater of Operations. The badge in the center here is the Combat Seabee badge. All Seabees that served in combat have that badge. This is the World War II Victory Medal. This is the World War II Good Conduct Medal. And these last 2, this one and this one, are from the Philippine government. I came home in 1945, about November. The war was over, and got leave, came home for Christmas, 1945. Reported back to San Diego in January, and I was there until June, when I was discharged in June. And what we did in that period of time was at that point they were mothballing ships there, cocooning them, and taking out all the equipment and stuff like that from destroyers and different Navy ships. And we were kind of in charge of the transportation and that type of thing. We handled the equipment and transportation. duties on the base. And so I was there waiting for discharge, had points, was waiting. Ed Johnson, who was a former governor of Colorado and was a senator, and Senator Johnson, he was also head of the Armed Forces Service Committee, I guess they call him. When I was in San Diego down there waiting for discharge, I suddenly got wind that they were taking some of the younger men and reassigning them to Pacific duty in a thing. And this didn't go over too well with me. I still felt pretty patriotic, but this wasn't my, I wasn't planning a career. So the only thing I could think of, or the only name I could remember, was Ed Johnson. So I sent him a telegram. And about 3 or 4 days later, I got called to the base commander's office and walked in, and he was a little hot under the collar. And he started raking me over the coals a little bit, and he said, "What?" He said, "I want to know what your connection is with Ed Johnson." I said, "What do you mean?" And he threw this telegram across the desk, and the telegram says, "Freeze any further duty changes for Jack C. Tanner. Send immediately to the nearest separation center, Ed C. Johnson." That telegram.
So how did it work?
Oh, it worked beautifully. Oh, he was totally steamed, but he didn't know what to do. You know, this guy was commander of the 12th Naval District, but he admiral, but he, you know, he knew he was looking at the looking at his boss, so to speak. You know, so they actually put me on a DE boat and took me from San Diego to San Pedro by myself on a DE boat. I stood up on the deck, went to the separation center. When I was discharged, I came back to Denver. It was summertime, so did a few odds and ends things waiting for school to start in September. Enrolled at DU, and I started school at September. I went to DU, and my father was in the appliance building. Had built a building on South Broadway and was in the appliance business. And in May of '51, he died of a heart attack. And so I dropped out long enough to take over the business and run that for a couple of years. Then I went back to school, eventually finished. I do have a BA in business administration and a master's in business also. I spent about 20 years or a little better in the appliance industry, and owned retail stores and was in the wholesale end of it, and worked for manufacturer and that. And then I spent another about 24 years in the insurance business. We both went to the same high school, and we were a couple of years apart in a thing, and had crossed paths a number of times in our life, but even she had attended some things that my sister had attended and so on and so forth, but we never really met till after the war. And I was home, and a friend of mine named John Frank was also home at the time, and he was in the Navy, and he was in amphibious. He was a signalman on a PT boat, but he was home, and he met this girl, name was Jeanette Hines, and he wanted to date her, but she wouldn't date unless it was there were two of them, you know, her girlfriend, you know. So John called me up and he said, "Jack," said, I got a date with a girl that I very much like to go with, but she insists that we double date, you know, with a girlfriend. Would you go?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll go." So that's how we met. And I met on a blind date.
When were you married?
And we were married in 1946, June. June the 8th, 1946. 47, I'm sorry, 47. I moved to Broomfield in November 1956. Well, Broomfield was pretty small at that point. We had the first filing here was all, you know, that really existed, and old Broomfield across the highway. There were cottage schools. They hadn't built a permanent school building at that point. And my oldest daughter went to school down here at Emerald, or she went to cottage schools on 6th first, and then into Emerald. All my kids went to Emerald in grade school, and Cole. At that time, I said, as far as stores were concerned, we didn't have very much. Jim Van Buskirk, who's a realtor out here, had a grocery store in the basement of the bank. You know where Commercial Federal is? That was Empire Savings. Well, he rented a space in the basement of the bank, and he had a grocery store down there. And his wife did a lot of the store, operating the store, because Jim was also in the real estate business. But anyway, they had a grocery store down there in the basement of the bank. We also had a jail down there. Had one cell in the basement of the bank. And there was a barber shop down there. A fellow named Conover. You may remember the name, I don't know. Conover was a barber, and he had a barber chair down there. And then they built the where Target is today, the shopping center over there, and a hardware store went over there, which was Greenwald's, went in a hardware store. The bank moved over there. Broomfield Bank was there. And there was a paint store. Trying to remember what all was in there. Hardware store, paint store, the bank. And then Safeway built up there closer to the highway, about this side of where Phillips 66 is, and there up on that end was the first Safeway store up there. So that was our first store of any major store, was that Safeway store. And then Thriftway went in down there where the hardware store used to be. That was a Thriftway store, and the fellow's name was Gene Hill that ran that, I remember that. He had a grocery store there. That was just about the extent of it. At that time, we didn't have a police department. So what they did was, at that point, asked for volunteers. They deputized some of the guys that, younger guys that had time, that could give some time when they weren't working to the thing, and Boulder County deputized us. And during that one year, lasted about a year, that period of time, until we hired a full-time policeman, which was McCarthy. But during that period of time, we had quite a year. We had a train wreck up there by where the grain elevator is, that old grain elevator, and the train depot. 2 trains collided head-on up there, killed an engineer and badly injured a conductor, and I don't know, we had that. So we went through a train wreck. We had, let's see, we had the dam collapsed, but we had our water up on, and so we had a potential flood disaster there that we worked our way through. And then the shopping center burned down. We had a fire in the shopping center, and it was started in the paint store, and burned down the paint store, burnt the bank, burnt the hardware store, and all of that was rebuilt. But that was at the time. That was all part of it. We had they had a shooting in Lyons, and the fella came down from Boulder, from Lyons to Boulder, and from Boulder into Broomfield, and ultimately captured him somewhere between Broomfield and Boulder. And we had one car that Boulder County gave us, or lent us, police car, and we would alternate guys different times driving it. And McCarthy's wife, who was then, he was our first police chief. He was the policeman, and then he was the police chief when they finally hired another policeman. But his wife used to direct traffic at the schools. So, we had some interesting things for early day Broomfield. Oh, it's been fantastic. It's just hard for me to visualize sometimes how much growth we really have experienced here, and I think overall they've done a pretty good job of managing it. I get a little bit disappointed with the city administration sometimes about how I think the first filing gets a little neglected. I think my street out here is one of the worst in Broomfield, and my alley out here I know is the worst. And I tell them that occasionally, but nobody listens. Well, my oldest daughter is about to embark on a new project. She's going to New Zealand. They hired her to open a chain of restaurants in New Zealand, and she's right now she's in Mexico buying equipment to go over there, to take over there. So she'll be taking her two sons, who are high school age, over to New Zealand very shortly. That's my oldest daughter, and then my next oldest is my son, and he lives in Grand Junction, and he's in construction. And my youngest daughter is in Fort Collins, and she's a teacher. She teaches hearing deficit children.
What are the names of the children so we can kind of...
Tinian is the oldest. Terry is my son, and Lynette is my youngest. And my oldest has two boys. My son doesn't have any children. My youngest daughter has two girls, and they live in Fort Collins. He's a veterinarian up there, has a veterinarian hospital in Fort Collins, and she teaches, like I said, children with hearing deficits. In 1997, my granddaughter called me and said that her school were looking for veterans of World War II to talk to their classes, and they were going to have an assembly type thing, and would I be interested in participating? And I told her I certainly would be happy to. And I went up there. I found that what they were emphasizing in the thing was the atomic bomb seemed to be the big subject that they were studying at the time. But I found I was really kind of astounded that kids in junior high would have thought as much about, war in that period and whose responsibility and all this as they did. It was really, I kind of expected to be, a little childish maybe in that aspect. But they were very intelligent. They asked very intelligent questions. They really wanted to know what the pulse of the country was at the time, what the kids did, what people thought, and it was really, I think, enlightening for them to realize the unification that occurred, and I think that's something that a lot of adults need to know today. There's a lot of them, younger adults, that really don't understand that period, and pretty much people are pretty much involved with their own situations today. World War II, if you remember that period, we had tremendous cooperation among people. If they couldn't go in the military, they served as air raid wardens and all kinds of things. You know, it was really a real situation of unity, and there was a real understanding of what was going on in the world. The whole world was involved in this thing. Not that a world war is a desirable thing, but it was a period of time when there was a great unification in the world, and I think it's well worth people today pursuing some of the knowledge.